And now I am delighted to formally introduce Dr. Abul Rizvi PSM, who will present his open lecture on the topic of Australian immigration policy and the federal election. This topic will be a major and defining issue in the forthcoming election campaign. I have summarised Abul's education, professional roles and awards on this slide to add a little bit of colour to the stellar list of his roles and achievements. I say that he migrated to Australia as a child towards the end of the White Australia policy, which sought to prevent non-European migrants from entering. He may explain to us why this experience triggered his lifelong interest in migration policy. Dr. Rizvi is renowned for his fine-grained analysis of the demographic, economic, and budgetary impacts of immigration. His determinations and analyses have been used extensively in policy development, including in Australia's first and second intergenerational reports in 2002 and 2007, and in many other major policies. So who better than him to help us understand the implications of the current bipartisan plan to target international students as a way of reducing long-term net migration, and the intersections with the housing crisis and the opposition's plan to slash permanent migration levels to tackle it. As I mentioned earlier, Abul is available in real time for the Q&A following his presentations, and you can write your questions in the Q&A tab on your screen. Dr. Abul Rizvi PSM, welcome to the Royal Society of New South Wales.
Thank you, Dr. Pond, and thank you for the introduction. Just a little bit of background on myself. Yes, I did migrate with my father, in fact, slightly before the abolition of the White Australia policy. So we migrated in March 1966 on the basis of a special exemption granted to my father by Robert Menzies to enable and assist the establishment of Australia's first School of Oriental Studies at the ANU. Apparently, the ANU thought that a School of Oriental Studies without a single Oriental scholar might look a little odd, and they happened to be able to convince the Prime Minister that an exemption should be made. So they made the exemption, which enabled us to arrive in March 1966, and in April 1966, the then Immigration Minister, Hubert Opperman, took a submission to Cabinet when Harold Holt had then become Prime Minister, which made the initial decision to start to allow, in very rare circumstances, people of non-European background to migrate to Australia. And as a result, in 1966, the handsome number of 28 non-Europeans migrated to Australia, and 6 of the 28 happened to be my father and my mother and the 4 children. The fact that I ended up specialising in immigration policy was actually entirely an accident. I had been appointed for 2 years to a position with the Commonwealth Secretariat in Malaysia, and upon returning to Australia, I came back to the Department of Finance, which is where my home department was. They didn't expect my return. When I turned up, they said, "We'd better find you a job. There happens to be a vacancy looking after the budget of the Department of Immigration." And hence my lifelong interest in immigration policy, entirely accidental. I'll start the presentation now. Hang on a sec. I just need to share my screen. Here we go. So I'll focus on Australian immigration policy and the federal election. The slides I'll present are quite detailed and lengthy, and I'll go through a few of the slides quite quickly. unless people want me to go into more detail on some of them. The main focus is on the two competing sets of immigration policies, and hence the two competing sets of immigration and population futures Australia faces. While I don't want to bore people too much with definitions, it's really, really, really important that people understand the definition of two important words that will be used in discussing immigration policy leading up to the next election. The first is the migration and humanitarian programs. Now, people in Australia will have heard of those terms frequently in the last 40 or 50 years. That is the way most politicians have mostly explained immigration levels to the Australian public. The migration and humanitarian programs represent the number of permanent visas issued in a financial year, irrespective of whether the person is onshore or offshore, and irrespective of whether the person comes to Australia after getting the visa, and irrespective of whether the person might stay long-term or actually leave straight away, which can sometimes happen. So it's just the number of authorisations to stay in Australia permanently, not the number of people who actually stay in Australia permanently. Around 60 to 70% of the people who are granted a permanent visa under the permanent migration program are to temporary entrants who are already in Australia and have been in Australia for some time and have already been counted in net migration. That brings me to the second term. The second term here that's important is net migration. Now, most people in Australia will not have heard of that term until the last year or two. And that's because government policy did not focus on net migration. Government policy only focused on permanent migration programs, and net migration was simply the outcome of the collection of immigration policies, both for temporary and permanent residents, that were in place. Important to note that net migration is for people who have been out of Australia long-term, irrespective of their citizenship and irrespective of visa type. So in other words, net migration includes, for example, Australian citizens who may leave the country long-term or indeed permanently. They may never return. It also includes Australian citizens who may have been out of the country 10, 15, 20 years and return. It includes the movement of New Zealand citizens. In other words, it includes all human beings who are in Australia for 12 months out of 16, minus the number of such people who depart and stay out of the country for 12 months out of 16. That is broadly an internationally recognised definition. So the possibility of the definition easily being changed is really pretty limited. And I would suggest focusing on, changing the definition of net migration may not be a very fruitful pursuit. So what are the alternative immigration policies? So the Labor government has announced a migration program of 185,000, which is near the highest levels of migration programs that we've had in our history. So that's near record highs, plus another 3,000 permanent visas for the new Pacific Engagement Visa, which is a visa for based on a lottery system to enable people from the Pacific to come and settle in Australia permanently. The Labor government has also announced a humanitarian program of 20,000 places, which is near the, once again, record levels in terms of the size of the humanitarian programs that governments have maintained. The Labor government has suggested a net migration target, although whether we can call it a target or not, I'm not quite sure, because sometimes ministers seem to be afraid of using the word target in terms of net migration, although they are gradually shifting in that direction. So they've suggested a long-term net migration target of 235,000 by 26-27, starting with a target in 24-25 of 260,000. I'll come back and discuss how achievable those targets are a little later in this presentation. But just to contrast the policies, the coalition government, the coalition, if it wins power, has proposed a migration program of 140,000, then eventually rising to 160,000. So effectively a cut of 45,000, with 2/3 of that program being in the skill stream and 1/3 in the family stream. That 2/3, 1/3 breakup is one that governments have pursued for quite some time, although there are some substantial legal issues in maintaining that I'll also discuss a little later. The Coalition has proposed a humanitarian program of 13,750, which is around the average size of the humanitarian program for the last 20 to 30 years. So that's probably not too far out of kilter from what Australians have experienced. The Coalition has also proposed, and this is where things get difficult, a net migration target of 160,000 per annum, starting from some time in the future, unspecified, although when it was announced, Mr. Dutton proposed it as a contrast to the 260,000 proposed by the Labor government. I'm not sure there was a lot of science in the 160,000 figure, other than the fact that it was 100,000 less than 260,000. We've not seen any other details from the Coalition on how the 260,000 would be achieved, although the Coalition has indicated broad support for capping student numbers. In implementing its policy, the Coalition would need to take into account the position of the National Party. The National Party has said it broadly supports the Coalition policy of both the size of the migration program and net migration, but has suggested that regional visas, and regional visas are quite broad in number in the Australian system, would be off limits. The National Party, particularly Mr. Littleproud, who is very proud of his old agriculture visa, which was put in place by the Coalition government, but was abolished before it could get off the ground by the Labor Party. Mr. Littleproud has suggested he may resurrect that visa. How that visa would fit into the target for net migration is not clear. So just a little bit of history. How did we get here? Firstly, in the 2019 budget, net migration was forecast at just over 270,000 per annum. That was about 30 to 40,000 higher than net migration at that time. The higher level of net migration was designed to support the projections in the Back in Black budget. It was designed to help get the budget back into the black. Whether it would have or wouldn't have, we'll never know, because we had COVID and the 270,000 could never be realised. Net migration then during COVID fell into negative territory. That was the first time since around World War II that net migration was negative. Net migration being negative in Australia's history is relatively unusual. The three key points in our history where net migration has been negative, apart from COVID, has been World War II, the Great Depression, and World War I. So essentially associated with major events. After net migration fell into negative territory, the Coalition introduced a wide range of visas to try to get net migration to grow quickly after COVID, including things like unlimited work rights for students, the ability for working holiday makers to get a third working holiday maker visa, fee-free student and working holiday maker applications, and of course the special COVID visa, which could be accessed by temporary entrants, including students, without any need to demonstrate any particular skill or any particular job, other than having a job, any job, or having the offer of a job, any job. Not surprisingly, that led to a very rapid growth in net migration, and the Labor government throughout 2022 remained under pressure to allow that rapid rate of net migration to keep rising, because many of you will remember in the second half of 2022, the complaints from the business community about labour shortages were quite intense. And indeed, Mr. Dutton, in the second half of 2022, was criticising the Labor government for not increasing net migration fast enough. So let's just talk a little bit about the migration program, and then I'll come back to net migration. So we have there the 24-25 migration program as defined by Labor, not including the 3,000 places for the Pacific Engagement Visa, which effectively brings the migration program up to 188,000. The Coalition has proposed bringing that down to 140,000, with 1/3 in the skill stream and 1/3 in, 2/3 in the skill stream and 1/3 in the family stream. Now, the difficulty it's going to have there is, in theory, that could be achieved, the family stream of 46,300, which would be 1/3, if partner places could be held at 43,500 and a dramatic reduction in parents and other family categories down to 2,800. Remembering that in parents, there is a queue of parent applications well over 100,000. So that would be 2,800 places for a queue well over 100,000. But legally, that is doable. Whether that works out politically or not, who's to say? The difficulty is going to be with partners, because the Migration Act does not allow the government to limit the number of partner and dependent child visas. For the government to hold partner and children visas at 43,500 is near on impossible, because the application rate is now very, very high at over 60,000 per annum and rising, and the backlog of partner visas is now over 75,000. In my view, what the government is doing in limiting the number of partner visas to 43,500 is unlawful. To cut the migration program down to 140,000 and still only hold partner visas at 43,000 I think would be pushing the boundaries of what the government can get away with before there are appeals to the High Court that force the government into managing partner visas and dependent child visas on a demand-driven basis as required by the Migration Act. Now let's turn to the components of net migration. What you can see there is net migration in 2018-19, that is the year immediately before the pandemic. And then you've got net migration in 22-23, when we had the highest level of net migration in our history by over 200,000. So the size of net migration in 22-23 is completely beyond anything we have ever seen in our history, at 528,000. We had students contributing around half of that at 264,000, and most of the other categories, other than permanent migrants, were close to record levels. New Zealand citizens at 25,000 increased quite considerably, but it still didn't reach record levels, so they're still below record levels. The number of Australian citizens was at negative 32,000, which is the highest rate of emigration of Australian citizens in our history. So if that hadn't happened, net migration would have been even bigger still. To bring that number down to 235,000, as proposed by the Labor government, is a very, very stiff challenge. To bring it down to 160,000, I think, if I was asked to advise the coalition government again, I think I would use Sir Humphrey Appleby's words of, that's a very, very courageous policy, Minister. This graph shows the steady rise in the student contribution to net migration. So the blue line is the student contribution to net migration. The orange line is net migration overall. As you can see, the student contribution to net migration prior to COVID was steadily rising. fell sharply during COVID, and then rose very, very significantly after COVID. What that's resulted in is the number of student arrivals rising strongly, student departures also beginning to rise, albeit off a very low base. So the net movement of students, not necessarily net migration, but the net movement, that is both short-term and long-term movements, increased dramatically during 22-23, fell back marginally, well, quite significantly perhaps, in 23-24. We don't yet know what will happen in 24-25. As a result, the student contribution to net migration was very strong through 22-23 and was probably strong again in 23-24, but not as high as the 264,000 of 22-23. The stock of students steadily rose, and students moving on to the temporary graduate visa also steadily rose and is now at record levels. We've never had much over 100,000 temporary graduates in Australia. To have over 223,000 temporary graduates in Australia and rising strongly is a substantial issue from a policy perspective, let alone the question of managing net migration. A large portion of those temporary graduates would be looking for a permanent resident outcome. The problem is going to be in a migration program of 185,000, they will not all get permanent residence, and in a migration program of 140,000, it's even less likely they would get permanent residence. That will create problems. I've been through a few student visa booms. This isn't the first one in our history, although it's by far the largest. The first stage of a boom was started under the coalition government when it stomped on the student visa accelerator, and with the Labor government too slow to respond, the numbers just got out of control. Eventually, the Labor government started tightening, and it introduced a range of tightening measures right through 23-24, and now it's moving towards student caps. I'll come back to caps shortly. The third stage of a student visa boom is, what do you do with the large number of students and temporary graduates in the country, many of whom have come with a view to securing permanent residence, and if not that, to remaining in the Australian labour market long term to enable them to earn a sizable living. The third stage of the student visa boom is always the longest. It's always the most painful. It's always the most difficult to deal with. This graph just shows what happened with the boom. So the dark blue columns are the pre-COVID monthly records of offshore student visa applications. The 2022 figures in every month other than January beat the pre-COVID record. In 2023, the 2022 records were once again beaten in every month. In the early part of 2024, offshore student visa applications remained strong in January, but then you can see the dramatic fall from February onwards. They will rise in the latter part of 2024. In fact, in order to hit the student visa caps, the application rate will have to rise and student visa grants will have to rise. That may sound a bit perverse, but in fact, the caps have been set at a level substantially higher than what would come out if current application rates continue. During the 12 months of 23-24, an enormous number of changes were made to tighten student visa policy. I won't go through them all. They're there for people to peruse. Many of you will know the changes that were made to try to bring the application rate, the offshore application rate, down. Skilled temporary entry, that's the old subclass 457 that many of you will know of. It was changed under Mr. Dutton as Home Affairs Minister into subclass 482. Quite a substantial number of changes were made by Mr. Dutton, which tightened policy in that area very significantly. When Mr. Dutton left, the ministry and new coalition ministers were appointed, the business community pressured the coalition government to start winding back many of Mr. Dutton's changes. The Labor government has continued to make changes to this visa as well. It's continuing at the moment in terms of application rates at a very high level. I would be surprised, given the strength of the labour market, whether the Labor government or indeed the coalition would significantly tighten this area. On that basis, I see it as unlikely that the contribution of this category to net migration falling significantly unless there is a dramatic weakening of the labour market. You might wonder, in the context of net migration, why I'm talking about visitor visa policy. But actually, visitor visa policy is very important because those people who come to Australia on a short-term visitor visa and then apply for a further visa onshore and remain in Australia for 12 months out of 16 are counted in net migration. In fact, in the lead up to COVID, the visitor contribution to net migration was booming. And after COVID, it's resumed booming again. And it's against that background that the government has introduced many measures to tighten visitor visa policy. How effective those measures will be, we'll just have to wait and see. But one of the key changes they've made is that from 1 July 24, visitors are unable to apply onshore for a student visa. That makes it very difficult for some education providers to access students, particularly in the vet sector, where onshore recruitment tends to dominate, whereas for the higher ed sector, offshore recruitment is the dominant means of recruiting students. Another issue in this context is asylum. Traditionally, students do not apply in large numbers for asylum. We have had since 2016 a very significant bout of labour trafficking, abusing the asylum system. The numbers have worked their way through the primary stage into the AAT, which is now the ART, but you can see the phenomenal rate of increase in asylum applications. The reason this is relevant to students is because in the last 6 months, students as a component of new asylum applications has increased strongly, and they are now working their way into the AAT. As the third stage of the student visa boom becomes more prominent, students applying for asylum will continue to be strong, and that will be an issue for the Immigration Minister. Working holiday makers also contribute to net migration, and in the last year or two, they have made very strong contributions to net migration. Many new working holiday maker agreements have been established. Second and third working holiday maker visa opportunities have been established, driving up net migration. We now have working holiday maker visas for UK nationals, which have now a 3-year duration, with an age limit increased from 30 to 35. We also have a new work and holiday visa for India. All of that is contributing to net migration. Now, the government could tighten policy in that space to get net migration down, but I suspect they would run into quite a fight with the National Party, because work and holiday visas and working holiday maker visas spend substantial amounts of time in regional Australia, in tourist spots, and they also contribute substantially to the agricultural labour force. I think any coalition government that wanted to tighten policy on working holiday maker visas would run into quite some difficulties with the National Party. There's then a whole host of other temporary visas. The big ones here are temporary graduates. As I mentioned earlier, we now have something in the order of 225,000 temporary graduates in Australia. That number will keep rising, at least for the next 6 to 12 months. I don't see that number falling. And the question from a policy perspective is, how does government manage that group of people who, a substantial portion of whom are looking for a permanent migration outcome, but there aren't enough permanent migration places? Another a visa that would be of interest to people interested in the student area is the number of bridging visas issued to students in the last 6 to 12 months. That has increased very, very dramatically as we get more and more onshore student visa applications. The ability of the Department of Immigration to process those quickly has been limited. They just don't have the money to be able to process those visas quickly. And as a result, the backlog keeps growing. There are now well over 100,000 applicants, onshore applicants for student visas who are currently on a bridging visa waiting for a decision. If large numbers of those are refused, they will then appeal to the AAT, and we are also now seeing the backlog of visa applicants appealing their decision at the AAT rising sharply, over 17,000 now, and rising at about 2,000 per month. Permanent migrants, as I said, make a relatively small contribution to net migration because 60 to 70% of them are already in Australia. So cutting the permanent migration program actually doesn't do much to help you cut net migration. You've got to deal with other parts of the net migration system, particularly students, temporary entrants, working holiday makers, etc. New Zealand citizens are also now contributing significantly to net migration. Part of the reason is the relatively strong labour market in Australia compared to the New Zealand labour market. Another reason is New Zealand citizens now don't need to go through the permanent migration program. If they have spent more than 4 years in Australia, they have a direct pathway to Australian citizenship. Those two factors make Australia very attractive for New Zealand citizens. So we are likely to see New Zealand citizens continuing to contribute strongly to net migration. Whether a coalition government is prepared to tighten policy in that space is an open question. I don't know whether they would or wouldn't. Australian citizens, as I mentioned, in 22-23 made a large negative contribution to net migration. But in 23-24, there was a large return of new Australian citizens to Australia, and they didn't make the kind of negative contribution to net migration that we saw in 22-23. What happens in the future will depend almost in this space, will depend almost entirely on the strength of the Australian labour market. If the Australian labour market remains strong, we will see more Australian citizens returning and fewer Australian citizens departing, and thus making the task of reducing net migration more difficult. So some quick conclusions. New visa initiatives over the last 10 to 15 years have really increased the structural level of net migration to Australia. Under current policy settings and in a relatively normal labour market, that could be well over 300,000. Getting net migration down to Labor's target of 235,000 or 160,000 as proposed by the coalition would require a range of really very difficult and controversial decisions. The good news is no future government will again ignore management of net migration, but managing net migration is not easy, and I am not convinced either major political party has yet concluded its thinking on how it's going to do that. That's my presentation to this stage. I'm happy to take questions.
In Abul, that was an extraordinary canter through what I must say I hadn't thought of, but it feels rather like a policy mess, at least as bad as that period in the 60s when the White Australia policy finally saw its sort of rather slow death knell. I do remember being in on post, and the immigration officers just said, "Oh, look, fit in," and they're not going to fit in if they're black, they said, even though the policy had changed. So we're in a really difficult time. And I think the complexity is just extraordinary, and you've taken it through us so much. Clearly, what we're getting to in policy, I mean, it is not a solution to the housing crisis, which for some reason seems to have become a very big area. It's certainly not going to be a solution to the Australian economy, which desperately needs skilled migrants. Should we be worrying as much as we do about net migration? Or should we be thinking about some other measure? I mean, we've just seen in the United States an election that looks as though it's been driven by, among other things, fear of migration.
Yes. I'm glad to say I don't think our situation is anything like the policy challenges Mr. Trump has set himself. That's the good news. I mean, the policy challenges Mr. Trump has set himself are just mind-boggling. I wrote an article of about 5,000 words trying to explain how I'd go about implementing Mr. Trump's policies, and I must say my head was reeling about at the how would you do this? It's difficult. Ours is difficult, but not that difficult as Mr. Trump's situation. The really difficult issue for Australia is that the targets that both parties have set do not have any connection to a long-term thought-out plan. They are targets that have been selected for political purposes, and then somehow the government is supposed to deliver on those targets. In December, the ABS will publish its preliminary estimates for net migration for 23-24, and the government will have missed that target, in my calculations, by about 70,000. And, they'll say, oh, that's not too bad. I'm not sure Mr. Dutton will let them get away with that's not too bad. And I'm not sure Australian media will let them get away with that's not too bad. On my calculations, the target that they have set themselves for 24-25, the current financial year, of 260,000, on my calculations, on the current set of policy settings, and assuming a reasonably strong labour market continues, they will miss by about 100,000. That doesn't help anybody. That just creates, I think, a situation for the public where they just lose ability of government to manage net migration. And unfortunately, I don't think we can get away from the management of net migration now, predominantly because net migration is the figure used by the Australian Bureau of Statistics to count Australia's population. And the counting of population drives just about everything in terms of the economy, the budget, and so on.
I do remember someone in the UK university sector saying, look, we've just got to give up net migration when it comes to student visas, put student visas outside. There's a question here from Peter Bohm, which comes to that issue of the student visas. Is there real substance to the Vice-Chancellor's objection to the policies that we've had? At the very least, we cannot say that they've been clearly articulated or well presented, but is there...
if they are criticising the mechanism of student caps, they are right. I think in an article I described it as bad policy being implemented badly. Everything about it is bad. If our objective is to recruit the best students we can recruit and to manage that in a way that meets our broader immigration objectives, student caps don't work. There is a lot of substance in the complaints, I think, of the Vice-Chancellors of long-term underfunding of research in Australian universities, no question of that. And it is undoubtedly the case that governments, implicitly or explicitly, universities to recruit from overseas as a way of making up for that shortfall. And as a result, we have a very bad set of policy outcomes. That's no question about that. But the solution is not to just keep growing the overseas student program. because essentially what you end up doing is creating a bigger and bigger and bigger cohort of people who would be in immigration limbo. And eventually that leads to really, really bad outcomes.
Yeah, I'd quite like to follow it up. I've got a couple of other questions, and I do invite anybody to put questions into the Q&A, or if that doesn't work, into the chat, but into the Q&A, please. But first of all, I think as an educationalist, while one understands that the universities have become so dependent on international student income and can see why, I think that there have been some bad outcomes with large groups of international students all speaking the same language in classes without any Australians or any other mix. That's not a good educational outcome, and it's something that I'm regretful for. But I also am acutely aware that all of the major universities, the group of 8 among others, are in real trouble with their budgeting at present. And it does seem a little cavalier to have plucked these caps out of the air and then really made lots of people at universities redundant.
Yes, yes. Bad policy leads to bad outcomes.
Yes, yes. I suppose, I think Susan Pond has a question. She wonders whether you could tell us the similarities and differences between Australian and Canadian student cap policies, and has the Canadian policy on student caps worked as expected and resulted in a decline in student applications?
The Canadian student caps were introduced much earlier. They were significantly more aggressive in their targets. They have reduced student applications very, very dramatically. In the first 9 months of 2024, they are down by 43% compared to the previous calendar year. And the next set of caps that the Canadian government has announced are even tighter than that. In addition, the Canadian government, and I'm not quite clear how they're going to achieve this objective, want to drive out current students and temporary workers to the tune of almost 1 million people over the next 2 years. That you can do on a spreadsheet, but you're talking about 1 million human beings, and 1 million human beings do not behave as governments on spreadsheets think they might behave.
So I saw that you wrote recently that the Canadian situation is rather different from the Australian situation, that they were in an easier position to put in caps.
Well, in the sense that there was political support and apparently public support for reducing immigration very, very significantly. 2 reasons for that. One was they have a much, much weaker labour market than us. So they have 6.5% unemployment now, and the participation rate, unlike ours, is falling. So it's in that context that perhaps it's a little easier for them to drive out 1 million people. If you have a really, really weak labour market, people may leave voluntarily and fewer people may arrive. So that's helping them. But in the longer term, they have two demographic phenomena that are important. One, they have the United States next door. And traditionally, the Canadians have lost people to the US. And that's a significant factor in their thinking. We, on the other hand, our nearest neighbour, New Zealand, tends to lose people to us. We're the magnet, we're the United States to New Zealand that the United States is to Canada. The second issue for Canada is they have they are further down the path of population ageing. 18% of their population is aged over 65. We're still 16%. 2% is a lot. Our median age is 38. and theirs is just over 40, now approaching 41. Their fertility rate is a lot lower than us, at 1.26 births per woman. In other words, their demography is in much more trouble than us because of those two factors. If you drive out 1 million people, and that's what they want to do, that changes their demography quite considerably.
Doesn't it mean they're all going to be old and nobody there to make the money that is going to pay for the pensions? I mean, if we drive out 1 million young students and workers, you're in real trouble.
Yes, the demographic calculations would also be challenging because young people have babies, old people don't.
Yes. All right. Well, look, that's a very, I mean, this area around students and schools, I know that when we first opened to international students, and of course, the international student market has been a huge money earner for Australia. It's given us huge reputational goods. It's brought to us actually rather of the students who stayed on, we've had some really excellent people. Now, originally, the idea was that people were to go back to their home countries, but I think that that's no longer the case. And I can't see why we shouldn't be having an educational policy which was going to encourage people to study areas of schools needs in Australia.
Yep, absolutely. We've always had a turbulent view of whether students should return or not. I mean, we had a view that all Colombo Plan students should return. Yes. But they didn't. I mean, I'm sure all of us know Colombo Plan students, or the children or grandchildren of Colombo Plan students who are still here and are very prominent Australians and making a very significant contribution to Australia. You know, Penny Wong comes to mind. Neville Roach, the head of Fujitsu, comes to mind. There are many. So that's always been a challenge. I've always had the view that the more transparent we are about pathways to permanent residence, the better. Let's be honest with them. Let's be honest with the Australian public, because the Australian public's part of it still regards students who stay on as permanent residents as somehow having rorted the system.
Whereas they actually pay rather a lot for their education.
Exactly. And to describe them as rorters, which much of the public and the media does, is just wrong.
Okay, so we've got that mistake about students. The other big mistake, it seems to me, is thinking that the housing crisis is driven by our student populations. Yes,
that's quite misleading. Yes, they do contribute to demand for housing, but given that given net migration is dominated by students and working holiday makers, they tend to occupy a very particular part of the housing market, particularly student accommodation around universities, and working holiday makers tend to stay in backpacker accommodation. Yes, they've contributed to the housing crisis, but the degree to which they've contributed to the housing crisis is well and truly overblown.
And an excuse for a total failure on public housing.
Yes.
I think that's very interesting. Now, here's another question from Rosalind Croucher. With the huge backlog in parents' application, can we manage it? How can it be managed? How should it be managed?
That's a very good question. The backlog in parent migration has been there now for close on 30 years. So it's not a new phenomenon. This has been around for a very, very long time. What the government has done is introduce what they call a long-term temporary parent visa. I get nervous about that idea, but it's there, it's in place now, and it's a growing visa. Deporting grannies and grandfathers is really hard. So if a long-term parent visa, temporary parent visa, remains in place, you will increasingly get circumstances where the long-term temporary parent doesn't want to go home, and their children and their grandchildren don't want them to go home. Trying to deport those people is just frighteningly difficult. It's one of those policies where there is no simple solution.
So it is fascinating to watch it. I might go back to the university sector for a short while, but the last question I'm going to ask, if I don't get any more, is going to be something around how can we have a better policy framework, that isn't just immediately sure. But look, on the university issues, it seems to me it's been a very, very unsatisfactory process for the universities, clearly for the universities. Yes. But I also think that both the media and to some extent the universities have been very dismissive of the private sector. I remember when I was in England, Mrs. May used to say, we only want the brightest and the best from overseas. And I was appalled by that. I mean, we don't have only the brightest and the best at our own higher education institutions. Why would we think that higher education should only be for the brightest and best? But worse than that, I think, what the private providers have done, and some have clearly been shonky, there's clearly been some very bad practice, but they do bring into the sector all sorts of different models of education, slightly more intensive. I mean, rather than going to Sydney University and having 40 people in your tute and 4,000 in your lectures, they're much more intensive, they're focused on language. And it seems to me that we should be thinking not, is somebody actually making money out of it, but rather, if we wanted, and it doesn't look like we do at present, the Australian higher education system to be regarded as one of the best in the world, we need to be able to offer these various structures and different models of higher education and different pathways.
Yes, I agree with that. I think there are two measures of success that are really important in this space. If one education provider is producing graduates, diploma, certificate level graduates, whatever level of graduates, who struggle then to get a skilled job for years and years and years, and then remain in what I describe as immigration limbo.
Driving taxis.
Something's gone wrong.
Yeah,
something's gone wrong. If an education provider is teaching people in such a way that they do get well-paying skilled jobs, and I'm not talking about, 500,000 or something, I'm saying, $70,000, $80,000 jobs, that is a positive outcome, irrespective of what they were taught or how they were taught.
Look, I think that's interesting. But then again, I discovered when I was working at a rural university here, which vaunted itself on having the highest employability outcomes for its students, that was because they had a huge online program where students who already had jobs were studying. So we've got to be careful about some of those really crude measures of employability as well. I think it's a tricky space to be in.
Yes.
What about my last question? How can we shift from this knee-jerk reaction and those policies? That slide of yours with the various policies that were used to reduce visas is hysterical. I mean,
yes.
It's almost as though somebody was saying, oh, well, have you got an idea now, down in the tea room? And they all tried everything.
Yes, they threw everything at it after a while, mainly because most of the changes they were making were not showing immediate results. So they just kept on throwing more and more things at it.
And deeply inequitable, because suddenly a whole lot of people who were perfectly respectable were having their visas refused. I mean, obviously there were some not respectable who had their visas refused, and I'm sure that there were real problems in the system. But
when you use highly subjective criteria to refuse large numbers of people, inevitably you're going to make lots and lots and lots of mistakes.
And of course, my British colleagues are quite delighted because they've been getting a lot of students.
they had their own problems with the idea that undergraduates couldn't bring their dependent. And look, that's never going to reverse because it was causing too many problems. But they're certainly getting a lot of international students now. So it is going to be very difficult to turn around and have a longer term view about what we should be doing. So just tell us what your longer term view is.
My longer term view is you want to start with where you're headed from a demographic and workforce perspective. That's not in respect of just students, but overall. And I haven't seen any evidence of a government being prepared to look at that long-term demography for quite some time. They've all been scared of talking about long-term demography because, apparently anyone who uses the word big Australia is evil. And the moment you start talking about population 20 or 30 years from now, it looks big. The number looks big. And so no government wants to talk about it. And that's a problem. Because how do you plan long-term if we're not prepared to talk about the long-term? So the demography debate has got to take place in Australia, and it's got to be a bit more informed than what we get. And unfortunately, the shock jocks and all of the various forms of the media distort that, as will politicians who will use a phrase or two to completely mislead Australians on what's happening. And I don't know how you get around that.
No, I guess the climate issues tend to make it slightly more complex than the whole demographic issues. Well, look, I mean, I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and there are so many more things that I've got lots more that I could have asked you, but I think perhaps we'll leave it there. It's a story that you've told us, which I don't think many of us knew, thanks to the sort of hopeless media coverage. I think it's getting better now that you're contributing quite so much to the understanding and with such a strong evidence base. I don't know how you get all of this data. Is it all in the public domain, Abul?
Oh, yes. All I have access to now is public domain data. I have no more access to anything other than public domain data.
But you know your way around that data. And as I say, I think the one thing that we might need to worry about now, if I'm understanding where things were when we joined this call, is that we might get a lot of potential US migrants as well as everything else.
Yes, quite possible. Quite possible.
Thank you very much. That was a marvelous speech, and I'm thrilled that we've got those very clear slides to help us understand. And I'll hand over to Susan Pond to close the meeting.